Midnight in the Garden of Shadows. A haunting escape. Hook. Can you ever truly escape the darkness? Watch as one woman fights to break free from a garden of horrors, only to discover that escape might be the last thing she truly wants or needs. Stay tuned until the shocking end. You won't believe what happens next. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the garden. The air felt thick, heavy with an unspoken weight. Every step on the gravel path echoed louder than usual, sharp against the stillness. A soft rustle came from the bushes. Not a wind, but something else, something moving. Her heart quickened. She paused, breath shallow. The garden was beautiful by day, but now, in the dead of night, it felt different. Alive almost. The scent of damp earth and growing plants mixed with something faintly metallic. She couldn't place it. A flash of movement caught her eye. Quick. Too quick. A shadow darted behind the old stone fountain. She squinted, but saw nothing. The wind picked up. She felt the hairs on her neck rise. The garden seemed to grow darker. Closer. She wasn't alone. The trees swayed unnaturally, bending toward her. A soft whisper curled through the leaves. Faint, but clear. Go. The word struck her like a bolt. Her feet didn't move. She couldn't move. A figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, thin, its face obscured by a hood. No features, only darkness. It stepped closer, its presence suffocating. The air grew colder, sharper. She felt it now, its eyes, though hidden, were watching. She could hear her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears. A rustling noise came again, louder this time, from behind her. A creeping sound, like the soft scrape of fingers along stone. She spun around, but saw nothing. The garden was empty. But it wasn't. The feeling of being watched intensified. The figure took another step toward her. Closer. The whispers were louder now, swirling around her like wind. Leave. They urged, almost pleading. Her chest tightened. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't obey. She was rooted in place, trapped between the shadows and the oppressive silence. A movement, faster than the last. A hand reached out. Long fingers, bone-thin, brushed her cheek. She froze, a cold shiver crawling up her spine. The figure loomed over her, silent. No breath. No sound. Just a presence that filled the air. The trees swayed again, bending even closer. The path ahead was blocked, but the garden seemed endless. She backed away, and the figure followed. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The ground beneath her feet felt uneven, as though the garden itself was shifting. Every step she took seemed to sink into the earth, like the ground was pulling her down. She stumbled, and the figure moved faster. Closer. She could feel the cold of its presence, even without touching it. A low, rasping breath echoed in the air. The whispers returned, louder now. Leave, before it's too late. She turned, eyes wild.
But the garden had changed.
The path she had followed was now twisted, tangled with vines and thorns. There was no way back. She could hear something in the distance, moving through the trees. Footsteps, though not her own. Someone was coming. The figure didn't move. It stood still, unmoving, its dark form blending with the shadows. But the air around her thickened, and the temperature dropped further. She felt a coldness seep into her bones. A distant cry echoed through the night, like the sound of someone in pain. Or warning. Her breath hitched. The sound came closer. Something was coming for her. And she knew, deep down, it was already too late. The trees seemed to groan under the weight of the night. The whispers grew frantic. Leave. Leave now. A branch snapped nearby, sending a wave of panic through her. She spun around, searching for the source. But the garden had swallowed it up. The figure, still unmoving, never blinked. The sense of dread settled over her like a shroud. She was not alone. The footsteps were unmistakable now, growing louder with every passing second. Something large, something dark, was moving toward her. But still, the figure didn't move. She tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, like she was wading through thick mud. The path seemed endless. And then, in an instant, the figure was gone. Not a trace. Nothing. Just the crushing silence of the garden. But she could still feel its presence. That darkness. The footsteps stopped. The air was still, heavy.
Too still.
It was the quiet before the storm. And then, a sharp noise, like a branch snapping, pierced the silence. She turned, but saw nothing. Only the deep, dark shadows of the garden. And the sound of something breathing. The breathing was slow, deliberate, heavy. It came from all around her, as if the very air was alive. Her pulse quickened. The hairs on her neck stood on end. She couldn't tell where it was coming from. The darkness seemed to press in, thicker now, suffocating. Every step she took was met with an eerie crunch of dead leaves beneath her feet. Then, the whispers returned. More urgent, more desperate. Leave now. But her legs were frozen. A chill crawled up her spine, colder than anything she had ever felt before. The air smelled of decay. And something worse. Something foul. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt as if the earth itself was reaching for her, pulling her deeper into the garden. And then, through the thick shadows, a shape appeared. A figure, tall and twisted. It moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. Its eyes, black as night, locked onto hers. There was no face, no features, just darkness. The breath she had been holding caught in her chest. It stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. She stumbled backward, her pulse hammering in her ears. But there was nowhere to go. The path was blocked. The figure was closer now. Its presence filled the space, suffocating, choking her with its very being. The whispers had turned into a low, guttural growl. Leave, or stay forever. Her feet refused to move. Fear wrapped around her like chains. The figure stretched its hand toward her. Long, bony fingers, sharp as claws, reached through the dark. Her throat tightened. She could hear its breath, now steady, growing closer, faster. A scraping sound. The fingers brushed against her arm, cold and unyielding. The world seemed to narrow, the shadows closing in from all sides. It was right there now. She could feel its breath on her skin. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't. Then a voice.
Low.
Grating. Run. The word echoed in her mind. A command. Something deep inside her snapped. She turned and ran. Feet pounding on the gravel, lungs burning with every breath. The path twisted and shifted, disorienting her. The garden seemed endless, stretching out in every direction. The figure was behind her. She could hear its footsteps, too close now, too fast. Her chest tightened, her body aching from the effort to escape. The ground beneath her feet felt softer now, like it was giving way. She risked a glance over her shoulder. It was gaining on her. Closer, closer. A dark blur, moving swiftly. Her heart raced. There had to be an exit, a way out. But the garden had changed. The trees, the plants, everything seemed to be closing in on her. She reached out, grabbing at the nearest tree for support. The bark was cold, slick with moisture. And then it was there, right behind her. Too close. She spun around, but before she could react, it grabbed her. A cold grip tightened around her wrist. The world went black, her body was yanked back, violently, into the darkness. The cold grip tightened around her wrist, pulling her deeper into the garden. She struggled, trying to break free, but the hand was unyielding. Its fingers were like ice, digging into her skin. Her heart raced as she kicked and clawed at the air. But the more she fought, the more the darkness seemed to close in. Her vision blurred, the shadows swirling around her. She gasped for breath, but the air felt thick, almost suffocating. The whispers returned, louder, more frantic. Don't fight, just let go. The words wrapped around her mind like chains, pulling her toward the cold presence behind her. The figure's form was a dark blur, shifting like smoke. She felt her strength draining away, as if the garden itself was leeching it from her. A cold laugh echoed through the night, hollow and eerie. Her body felt weightless now, as though she were floating. The grip on her wrist loosened slightly, but she didn't dare try to pull away again. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her thoughts scattered. She couldn't think clearly. The whispers were louder, now almost deafening. Stay with us." She felt herself being dragged deeper into the heart of the garden. The trees loomed over her, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid, but soft, almost liquid. She was sinking. The darkness seemed to pull at her, a tangible force, suffocating her every move. Then, a sudden change. The grip released. She stumbled forward, her feet catching on the uneven ground. She was no longer being pulled, but the garden had shifted. The path was gone. There was no way back. She turned in every direction, desperate for an escape. But the garden had become something else entirely. The air was thick with decay, the trees like twisted guardians, closing her in. The shape of the figure was no longer clear. It was everywhere and nowhere. It watched her. She could feel it, its cold gaze pressing against her skin. And then, faintly, a light. A soft glow flickered in the distance, barely visible through the mass of tangled branches. Hope surged in her chest. She ran toward it, but the light shifted, fading, always just out of reach. Her feet stumbled, faster now, desperate to escape. But the garden had become a maze, the paths turning in impossible directions. She felt the ground give way beneath her again, sinking deeper into the earth. The darkness was closing in once more. And the whispers, they were not just whispers anymore. They were voices. Real voices. "Leave," they said. "Leave, before it's too late." But there was no way out. The voices became louder, more insistent. "Leave, or stay forever." Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythm frantic. She couldn't breathe. The air around her grew thicker, heavier. The light in the distance flickered again, but now it seemed like a cruel illusion. No matter how fast she ran, the garden seemed to stretch endlessly, changing with every step. The earth beneath her feet felt like it was shifting. Each turn she took brought her deeper into the twisted maze. The whispers grew angrier now, more desperate. "Leave now. It will claim you." She tried to push forward, but her legs were weakening, as if the ground itself was pulling her down. The trees bent toward her, their gnarled branches scraping against her skin. Something cold and sharp grazed her arm. She winced but couldn't stop. Every shadow seemed to move, reaching for her, closing in. A sound, like bones snapping, echoed from behind. She spun around, but there was nothing there, just the endless garden, the darkness pressing in. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just the garden anymore. It was alive. The earth beneath her feet groaned, as though it had a voice of its own. The trees seemed to whisper, their branches weaving together, blocking her way. The ground split open, revealing a darkness deeper than night. A deep, hollow sound emanated from it, a low hum that resonated through her bones. "Come closer." A voice, low and beckoning, came from the chasm in the earth. Her body froze. It called to her. She didn't want to move, but her feet, they moved anyway. It was as though she was no longer in control. The voice called again, louder, more urgent. "Come." She took a step forward, then another. The air grew colder, the darkness more suffocating. The ground seemed to pulse beneath her, drawing her closer to the chasm. A chill ran up her spine. "Don't," she whispered to herself.
But the pull was stronger now.
Her body moved as if it had no choice. She was sinking into the darkness. The chasm below seemed endless. And yet, something was waiting for her to fall. The chasm yawned wide beneath her, its depths a void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. She teetered on the edge, her body trembling, unable to pull away. The whispers had become a chorus, a cacophony of voices that surrounded her. Come to us." The ground beneath her feet crumbled, falling away in small pieces, as if the earth itself was eroding. Her breath quickened, heart hammering. There was no escape. No way back. The darkness pulsed, its rhythm in sync with her racing pulse. She stumbled forward, her body moving of its own accord, as if the garden had taken control of her very will. Her arms flailed, trying to grab onto anything, but there was nothing. Only the cold, unyielding darkness. The whispers intensified, now shouting, "Don't fight it, come closer." Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, crawling toward the edge. Her fingers scraped against the earth, seeking something to hold onto, but the ground was soft, giving way like sand slipping through her grasp. She was losing control. "Please no." Her voice was a strained whisper, barely audible above the rising hum of the chasm. But the garden didn't care. It didn't listen. The air felt thick, heavy with the promise of something terrible, something ancient, waiting just below the surface. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with unnatural speed. It was the same figure, the one that had followed her from the start.
Tall.
Shadowed.
Silent.
But now, its presence was suffocating. Its eyes glowed faintly, an unnatural, sickly light. It stepped closer, the air growing colder with each step. She could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, pressing against her skin. She reached out instinctively, her hand trembling as it brushed the ground. And then, in the space between the figure and her, something else stirred. A shadow, darker than all the others, slithered from the chasm. It was alive, a writhing mass of darkness, shifting like smoke. It moved toward her, an unseen force pulling her closer to the edge. "No," she gasped, forcing herself to rise. But her legs betrayed her. She couldn't stand. She couldn't escape. The shadows crawled over her skin, cold as ice. The figure reached down, its hand now inches from her face, its fingers long and claw-like. The whispers had become deafening now, their words a chilling promise. Stay with us." Her body was being dragged closer, her feet scraping against the earth as the darkness closed in. She reached out, her last desperate attempt to cling to something, anything. But there was nothing, just the cold, suffocating darkness. And the shadowy figure, watching her with empty eyes. The earth beneath her crumbled one last time. And then, the world went black, her body fell, weightless, into the cold, endless abyss. The chasm swallowed her whole, darkness devouring her from all sides. She felt herself falling, tumbling through the void, the air thick with a cold that numbed her skin and her soul. The whispers, now twisted and maddened, surrounded her, swirling like a storm. "Stay forever with us." Her heart raced, her chest tight with panic. But there was no escape, no bottom, no end. She reached out, clawing at the air, but there was nothing to hold on to. Only the suffocating, oppressive darkness. Her breath quickened, her mind spiraling, her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. A sharp, sudden sensation pierced through her chest, pain, cold, like 1,000 needles pressing into her skin. She gasped. A scream, but it didn't escape her lips. It was swallowed by the darkness, absorbed by the void. The shadows twisted and shifted around her, shapes moving just beyond the edge of her vision, too fast to catch, too strange to understand. And then silence. A deep, crushing silence that seemed to press against her very thoughts. She floated, suspended in the emptiness, unable to move, unable to feel. And then something changed. A faint flicker of light appeared, far in the distance. It was small, fragile, but it pulsed, like a heartbeat, in the dark. She reached for it, instinctively, her fingers outstretched. The light grew brighter, closer. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt something, hope. But as she neared, the light flickered again, and then vanished. A wave of cold dread washed over her. The whispers returned, louder this time, rising to a deafening crescendo. Stay forever. She tried to move, but her limbs were heavy, sluggish.
She was trapped.
Trapped in this endless, empty place. The light returned once more, only to fade just as quickly. This time, something was different. A shape moved toward her through the darkness.
Tall.
Familiar. The figure. The same figure that had followed her. It stepped closer, its presence suffocating, its eyes glowing faintly in the void. She could feel its gaze.
Cold.
Unyielding. It reached out to her, its fingers long, sharp like claws, and brushed against her arm. She recoiled, but couldn't escape. The figure's form shifted, as though it was part of the darkness itself. And then a voice low, commanding, and chilling. "Now you are one of us." The words echoed in her mind, reverberating through her very being. Her breath caught in her throat. The darkness was no longer just around her. It was inside her, inescapable. And as she stood there, frozen in the void, the last trace of light vanished. And the whispers, those maddening whispers, filled her ears. Stay forever. And then, there was nothing but the endless, suffocating dark. The darkness pressed in on her, thick and heavy, like a tangible force. Her every breath felt strained, as if the air itself was fighting to keep her trapped. The figure was still there, its form shifting in the blackness, watching her with eyes that burned like cold embers. She wanted to scream, to cry out, to fight, but the words wouldn't come. The whispers rose again, urgent, frantic. Stay with us." She could feel them inside her mind now, as if they were part of her thoughts, twisting and distorting everything she had ever known. Her skin crawled, every nerve screaming in terror. The figure took another step forward, its silhouette growing larger. Closer. She could feel the ground beneath her feet shift, as though it was pulling her down, dragging her deeper into this nightmare. A pulse of energy, cold and sharp, radiated from the figure, striking her like a bolt of lightning. She gasped, the shock of it rattling her entire body. The figure raised a hand, fingers outstretched, and for the first time, it spoke in a voice that echoed through the void. "Your soul is ours now." The words cut through her like a blade. Her heart raced, panic flooding every inch of her being.
No.
She wouldn't let it happen. She couldn't. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, colder, drawing her in, pulling her closer. The darkness seemed to contract around her, suffocating her. Her vision blurred, her body trembling with an energy she couldn't control. And then a whisper, no, a command. "Come." Her body moved before her mind could even react. A surge of fear coursed through her, but it didn't matter. She was being dragged forward unwillingly, as if some invisible force had taken hold of her. The world around her twisted and turned, like a distorted reflection in a broken mirror. A flash of light. For a moment, she thought she saw something, someone, far in the distance. A figure. It looked like her. Her own face, but twisted, distorted, frozen in a smile that didn't belong. The darkness around her surged, swallowing it up in an instant. Her stomach lurched. A cold laugh echoed from the figure beside her. "That's you. That's what you'll become." She could feel her mind beginning to fray, the edges of her sanity unraveling as the figure's presence invaded every corner of her thoughts. "Join us, become one." The air grew unbearably cold, her limbs numb with fear, her every breath short and ragged. And yet, she moved forward. No matter how hard she fought, no matter how desperately she tried to resist, her body obeyed. The figure's hand hovered inches from her, its cold fingers brushing against her face. A chill ran through her, colder than any ice. And then she saw it. The chasm, no, the abyss, it was beneath her. The endless void had returned, the blackness yawning wide, waiting. And as she fell toward it, there was no more resistance, no more fear, only the cold, eternal pull of the darkness. The abyss below her grew larger, its darkness swallowing everything in its path. Her body fell, weightless, the world around her spinning. The cold air rushed past her, deafening in its silence. She wanted to scream, but her mouth was dry, her voice trapped in her chest. The whispers echoed around her, growing louder, more insistent. Fall, fall, forever. Her heart pounded in her ears, each beat a loud, frantic echo against the suffocating blackness. But there was no ground, no end, just the endless drop. Her limbs flailed, but she couldn't find anything to grab onto. She felt nothing but the deep, consuming void, an emptiness that felt older than time itself. A figure loomed ahead, rising from the shadows, its features still obscured, but its presence undeniable. The figure reached out, as though to pull her into its embrace. Closer, closer. Her body collided with it, but instead of pulling away, she was drawn deeper into its cold, unfeeling grasp. The figure's touch was like ice, sending a shock through her, freezing her to the core. Her skin burned with the cold, but there was no escape. A whisper, soft and dangerous, reached her ears. Join us, become part of the dark. It wasn't a choice. The words seeped into her mind, filling every corner, every crevice. Her body no longer obeyed her will. It moved without her consent, pulled further into the void. The figure loomed closer, its eyes glowing faintly like distant stars. And then, the whispers turned into something worse, something darker. Voices, familiar voices, twisted into something unrecognizable. Come home, Eve. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a split second, she remembered something. A face. A place. Something warm. Something human. But it was fleeting, slipping through her fingers like sand. The figure's hand reached for her once more, its fingers curling like claws, and this time, she couldn't resist. It gripped her arm, pulling her toward the blackened void that seemed to stretch infinitely. Her body moved in sync with its pull, the darkness surrounding her, drowning her every thought. The abyss had no bottom, no end. It only had this, the cold, the endless fall, and the promise of nothingness. The light she once glimpsed, her hope, flickered out like a dying star. And all that remained was the endless darkness, pulling her in, absorbing her into its depths. Forever, the pull of the darkness was relentless, suffocating, as though the void itself had become her own skin. Every breath felt heavy, each inhale filled with a cold, bitter emptiness that churned in her chest. Her body moved without will, her thoughts fading into a haze. The figure's presence loomed larger, closer, its grip unyielding, dragging her deeper into the abyss. And yet, in the depths of that suffocating blackness, something stirred. A flicker, a faint glimmer, far away, barely perceptible, like the first light of dawn breaking through a storm. Her heart quickened. Could it be hope? She reached for it, instinctively, desperately. Her fingers trembled, stretching toward that fragile light, as if it were the last breath of air in a drowning world. The figure's grip tightened, its cold fingers digging into her skin. Don't, it rasped, its voice echoing in the blackness. But she fought against it, the remnants of her will flaring in defiance. The light was real. It was there. She pushed against the figure's pull, forcing herself forward, inch by painful inch. The coldness of the void wrapped around her like chains, but she clawed at it, tearing at the darkness with every ounce of strength she could muster. The whispers swirled around her, louder now, angry. Leave it. You belong here. With us. Her mind was a battlefield, every part of her telling her to stop, to surrender, but she couldn't. She refused. The light grew brighter, closer. It wasn't an illusion. It was real. And for the first time, she felt the warmth of it, like sunlight on her skin after a long, endless night. The figure's grip loosened just slightly, its presence faltering in the wake of her resolve. She seized the moment. With one final push, she wrenched herself free, reaching for the light with everything left inside her. The darkness howled around her, an angry, tortured sound, but she didn't stop. She was closer now. So close. Her fingers brushed against the light, and in that instant, everything shattered. The abyss collapsed, the darkness tearing apart like fabric. A surge of warmth washed over her, pulling her up, away from the endless void. She gasped, her lungs filling with air again, her heart pounding in her chest. The light enveloped her, the shadows dissipating in its glow. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was nothing but light. Nothing but peace. But then, a shadow flickered at the edge of her vision.
No, it couldn't be.
The figure. It was still there, standing just beyond the light, its eyes glowing in the dimness. The whispers began again, softer now, like a distant echo. Stay with us. But she wasn't listening anymore. The light was her salvation. And this time, she wouldn't turn back. She pushed forward, into the warmth, into the light. The darkness receded. And the figure, the whispers, all of it, faded into nothingness. The light embraced her fully now, gentle, steady. For the first time, she felt whole.
Free.
The abyss was gone. And with it, the garden, but even as the light surrounded her, the feeling of freedom wasn't complete. Something lingered, a faint weight at the back of her mind, like an aftertaste that wouldn't fade. She could still hear the whispers, softer now, like a far-off murmur, but they were there. Stay, we are waiting. Her pulse quickened, but the warmth of the light pressed against her like a soothing balm, filling her with a strange sense of calm. She let herself sink deeper into the glow, letting it envelop her, trying to block out the remnants of the darkness that still clung to her thoughts. The cold had receded, replaced by something gentler, something safe. For a moment, she thought she might forget it all. The terror, the chase, the suffocating darkness, the figure. She shook her head, willing the memories to slip away. But then, in the distance, she saw it. A shape. Not the figure she had escaped, but something more familiar, more comforting. A person. A woman. Standing in the distance, bathed in the same soft light. She looked like her mother. She stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, drawn to the figure like a moth to a flame. The woman didn't move, but as she drew closer, the air around her seemed to thicken, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The woman's face was obscured by shadows, her features just out of reach, but something about her was comforting. "Come closer," the woman whispered, her voice melodic, soft. Her eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, she felt a surge of warmth, a connection, a love. But then, her vision blurred. The warmth began to wane, replaced by a coldness creeping through her limbs. The shadows twisted, creeping in from the edges, turning the once safe light into something more sinister. The woman's smile faltered, becoming twisted, her face now a mask of shifting shadows. And then she saw it, the figure again, the dark shape, moving swiftly behind the woman. Her stomach twisted. Don't let it pull you back, she thought, her heart racing. But it was too late. The figure reached out, its presence colder now, more powerful than ever. The woman's face contorted, her features distorting, her eyes blackening. "Join us," she said, her voice no longer soft and kind, but dark and hollow. "Stay." The woman's hand reached out to her, and without thinking, her body moved forward, as though the darkness had already taken hold once again. Her chest tightened as the shadows closed in. The light flickered, barely a flame against the suffocating darkness. And in that moment, she realized the truth. The light hadn't been salvation. It had been a trap.
She was still in the garden.
Still trapped. Still lost. And the whispers, the shadows, the figure, it was all a part of the same endless, twisting maze. The place she had thought she escaped was only waiting for her to return. And as the woman's hand closed around hers, cold as ice, the darkness consumed her once again. The moment the woman's hand touched hers, the darkness swallowed her whole, pulling her back into its depths with terrifying speed. The coldness was absolute, more suffocating than anything she had felt before. It felt like the garden itself had opened up to devour her. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the overwhelming weight of the void. The whispers returned, louder now, closer, like thousands of voices inside her head, echoing in a maddening chorus. "Welcome back, welcome home." They crooned, their voices hollow, as if they had always been there, waiting for her return. Her mind was spinning, the ground beneath her feet shifting, no longer solid but soft and shifting like quicksand. She tried to step forward, but it was as if the earth was pulling her down, dragging her deeper into the blackness. She could feel it again, the weight of the garden on her soul, the unrelenting force of the shadows pulling at her very core. And then, through the swirling chaos, she saw it again. The figure. The same twisted form, tall and obscured, its eyes glowing with that same unfeeling cold. It stepped forward, its presence suffocating, filling the space with a darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. It wasn't just watching her now. It was waiting. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why can't I escape?" The figure's lips barely moved, but the words cut through her like a knife. "Because you are ours. You always were." A sudden jolt of cold shot through her body, as if her very essence was being torn apart, piece by piece. The shadows coiled around her, tightening, wrapping themselves around her limbs, her chest, her heart. She could feel herself slipping, like she was sinking into the depths of some unseen sea, drowning in the very darkness she had tried to escape. The garden, it was not just a place. It was a force, a living thing, and she was its prisoner. No matter how hard she tried to fight, no matter how much she struggled, the darkness closed in tighter, suffocating every part of her, until all that remained was the cold, empty feeling of the void. The figure stepped closer, its presence now overwhelming, filling her senses, drowning out everything else. "You cannot leave," it whispered, its voice a soft, chilling promise. "You belong here now, just like the rest of us." Her breath caught in her throat. The whispers around her grew louder, pressing against her skull, filling every corner of her mind with their maddening chant. "Stay with us, stay forever." A wave of nausea crashed over her. The very thought of it, the endless, unyielding darkness, made her stomach twist in horror. She closed her eyes, her chest tight with fear, as the garden wrapped its tendrils around her heart, suffocating her will, her hope. And in that moment, as the figure's cold fingers brushed against her skin, she understood. There was no escape. There never had been. The realization hit her like a sharp blow to the chest. There was no escape. Not from the garden. Not from the shadows. Not from them. The cold fingers of the figure pressed against her, sending a jolt of ice through her veins. It wasn't just touching her. It was claiming her. Her heart hammered, but her body felt heavier, as though the weight of the garden was pressing against her soul, dragging her deeper into its suffocating embrace. The whispers continued, louder now, more insistent. "Stay, stay forever." She tried to move, to break free, but the garden was in her now, inside her thoughts, in every part of her being. There was no longer a place to run to, no place to hide. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling, not just with cold, but with the overwhelming pull of the darkness that wrapped around her like chains. The figure stepped closer, its form no longer blurry, no longer distant. It was real, and it was reaching out to her, its hands impossibly long, fingers curling like claws toward her face. "You belong to the garden now," it murmured, its voice like gravel scraping against her ears. "You're part of it. Part of us." Her mind screamed in protest, but the words, those words, latched onto her thoughts like iron hooks. She had felt it before. The faint flicker of light. The hope. But it was gone now. Faded like a dream on waking, slipping away as the shadows crept in deeper, suffocating every ounce of light. A chill wrapped around her throat as the figure's hand came closer, its fingers brushing her skin. She wanted to pull away, but it was too late. Her body was no longer hers. It was being molded, reshaped by the darkness, folding into it like clay into the hands of a master sculptor. The whispers returned, not as faint murmurs, but as clear voices, hundreds of them, surrounding her. "Welcome home," they said. "You've returned." The garden pulsed with a life of its own. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. The ground beneath her feet seemed to ripple, as though it were alive, breathing with the rhythm of the darkness. Her body was no longer her own. It was part of the garden now, part of the shadow. The figure's cold eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, she felt the garden consume her entirely. Her last thought, the fleeting echo of something that once resembled hope, shattered. And with it, she was lost. Lost to the darkness. Lost to the garden. And it would never let her go. The darkness closed in around her, suffocating, thickening like a storm cloud closing on the horizon. Her thoughts were a blur, fragments of memories slipping away like mist, vanishing into the all-encompassing void. She was nothing now. Nothing but a shadow, a part of the garden, an unwilling piece in a puzzle that had no end. The whispers were a constant hum, a maddening drone that never ceased, pressing in from all sides until it felt like they were inside her mind, crawling beneath her skin. Forever, stay, stay forever. She could feel it, feel herself changing, becoming a part of this place, an echo of the earth itself, twisted into something unrecognizable. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed whole, fading into the same oppressive quiet that smothered everything. Her vision flickered, and she saw flashes of faces, familiar faces, but they blurred like watercolors in the rain. Her family, the people she had once known, loved, their faces distorted by the shadows that now seemed to haunt her very memories. But they were no more than fleeting ghosts, fading away with every passing moment. The figure stepped closer, its presence heavier now, its gaze cold and predatory. Its form, once hazy, was solid, defined, unblinking eyes staring into hers, unrelenting. "Welcome," it said, its voice smooth, like velvet stretched over steel. "You are one with us now." The garden never forgets. It was true. The garden never forgot. It had taken so much, so many souls before hers, and it would take so many more after her. She was just another thread in its ever-growing web. The cold fingers of the figure grazed her face again, sending a wave of icy numbness through her skin. There was no pain anymore, only the absence of everything she had once been. She was empty,
Hollow.
a puppet with no strings to pull. But then, in the deepest pit of her consciousness, she felt it again. That flicker.
A spark.
A fleeting warmth that briefly pushed against the cold, as though something had not entirely been consumed. She held on to it. The light was possible. She reached for it, or, at least, she tried to reach for it. Her body felt like stone, every part of her immobilized, suffocating under the weight of the garden's presence. But the flicker, it was still there. Faint, barely a whisper of what it had once been. The garden could consume her. The shadows could take her. But there was a part of her that refused to let go completely. The whispers seemed to pause, their murmurs lowering, as though they were listening. "She's still fighting," one whispered. "She won't last," another responded. The figure's smile widened, showing its teeth, sharp, cruel, and predatory.
"She's ours now," it said.
But despite it all, despite the unrelenting darkness, that faint spark of light flickered once again, brighter this time. It was the last part of her that remained untouched, untouched by the suffocating garden, untouched by the shadow's embrace. And even as the garden clamped down tighter, even as the figure's fingers gripped her tightly, she realized one thing. There was still a choice, even if it was the last act of defiance she could make. And in that fleeting moment, the spark of light flared, just for an instant. Before the darkness swallowed her whole, the light flared, bright and desperate, like a last cry in the night before being drowned in a sea of shadows. It burned for a heartbeat, for just a moment, but it was enough to fracture the stillness. The figure recoiled, its cold gaze flickering, the smile on its face twisting. It hadn't expected this. The garden seemed to tremble, like something deep within it had been disturbed, something ancient, something that had laid dormant for far too long. The whispers faltered, growing hesitant, disjointed. Not like this," one murmured. "Not now." The figure's grip tightened, but now it felt less certain. A crack in the darkness. A crack she had not thought possible. The ground beneath her feet shuddered, and for a brief, impossible moment, she thought she might break free, thought she might escape the suffocating weight of the garden that clung to her like a second skin. But the figure's hand moved, sharp and fast, wrapping around her throat, squeezing. It was angry now, its form becoming even more twisted, more grotesque, as if it fed on her resistance. "Silence," it hissed, its voice like the scrape of metal on stone. "You belong here. You will stay." Her body trembled, her chest struggling for air as the figure's fingers dug into her skin. Her pulse hammered in her ears, but that flicker of light, that flicker, was still there. Somewhere. It was weak. It was small. But it was alive.
And she would not let it die.
With what little strength she had left, she reached deep within herself, reaching for that faint pulse of warmth. A sliver of defiance. A heartbeat of light. The whispers swarmed, louder now, a cacophony of voices urging her to surrender, urging her to join them, to let go. But she wouldn't. Not this time. She pushed against the suffocating grip, her arms shaking, her legs weak beneath her, but there was something in her, deep inside, that refused to let the garden have her. The figure snarled, its grip tightening, its eyes burning with rage. But it was too late. That light surged, a spark now turning into a flicker, and the garden shuddered again, a tremor that vibrated through the very air. The darkness was no longer absolute. The whispers faltered. The figure's eyes flickered with doubt. In the deepest part of the garden, something ancient and restless shifted. The chains that bound her soul began to tremble. And for the first time, the garden seemed afraid. The figure hissed, its form distorting as it tried to grasp her tighter, but she could feel it weakening. Feel the pull of the garden loosening, like fingers letting go of her. "Not now," the figure whispered in frustration, but its voice had faltered, no longer commanding. "You cannot escape." And yet, for all its threats, for all its dark promises, the shadows were shifting. They were not as solid as before, not as powerful. And in the chaos, in the tumultuous battle between the light and the dark, something finally cracked. The very ground beneath them splintered. The darkness fractured. And in that final, split-second moment, she felt the garden's grip release. And then, nothing for a brief, impossible instant, there was nothing. No whispers. No darkness. No suffocating weight of the garden pressing against her. Just stillness. A deep, almost sacred quiet that washed over her like a cleansing wave, pulling her from the depths of the void. She gasped for air, feeling her lungs expand, the sharp, desperate breaths a stark contrast to the suffocating silence she had just escaped. Her body, once heavy and bound by the garden's grip, now felt weightless, free. The shadows around her faded into nothingness, like mist evaporating under the first rays of morning. But as the last remnants of the darkness dissolved, she was left with a haunting emptiness, a vast, yawning silence that seemed endless. She blinked, unsure if she was still trapped somewhere, or if the garden had truly let her go. Her hands trembled as she looked around. The garden, it was gone. The twisted trees, the oppressive shadows, everything that had once surrounded her had disappeared, leaving only an infinite expanse of white light. She floated in it, disoriented, uncertain, but the oppressive heaviness of the garden was no longer there. Had she escaped? She could still feel the faint echo of the garden in her mind, like a ghost, lurking just beneath the surface of her thoughts, waiting. But for now, it was silent. And she was alone. Her pulse slowed, the terror of the past moments still lingering, but now replaced by a strange sense of freedom. The overwhelming weight of her fear began to ease, replaced with an odd kind of peace. Her hands fell to her sides, and she floated in the stillness, eyes wide as she tried to comprehend what had happened. The garden had let her go. Or had it? A distant sound. A flicker in the corner of her vision. The air seemed to ripple, just for a moment. Her heart raced again, the calm slipping away as quickly as it had come.
No.
She wasn't free. Not yet. The garden could never let her go completely. The ground beneath her shifted, but there was nothing solid anymore. Only the ever-shifting, pale void. And then, slowly, a shadow emerged, not from the darkness, but from the very light itself. A figure, familiar. A twisted reflection of the figure that had tormented her before. It moved toward her, slow and deliberate, its form flickering in and out of focus. Its cold, burning eyes met hers, and a familiar voice, soft and dangerous, whispered in the air around her. "You thought you were free?" Her breath caught in her throat. The flicker of hope from moments ago snuffed out as quickly as it had begun. The light around her dimmed, and the whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Come back to us." The garden. It was still there. And now, it was waiting. The figure's eyes burned with cold intensity, its smile twisted into something monstrous. "You're ours," it whispered, voice like gravel grinding against stone. "You always were." Her heart slammed against her ribcage, each beat a loud reminder of how close she had come to escaping. But the figure, it was still here, in the light. The flicker of hope that had surged through her moments before had vanished, replaced by the gnawing certainty that no matter how hard she fought, no matter how far she ran, the garden would never truly let her go. The figure stepped forward, its presence suffocating, wrapping itself around her like a storm. "Come," it coaxed, voice soft and velvety, a dangerous lullaby. "Come back to the garden. It's where you belong." The air grew colder, the light around her flickering and dimming. Shadows stretched from the edges of the void, curling toward her like hungry fingers. But there was no escape now. No place to hide. She was trapped. Again. The figure's hand reached for her, its cold fingers grazing her arm. It felt like ice, like death. But then something shifted. A pulse. A spark. It was so faint she almost missed it, but it was there. That faint spark of resistance. Of light. She could fight. She wouldn't let the darkness swallow her again. Not this time. With every ounce of strength she had left, she willed that spark to grow, to burst into something more. The light, though small, flared again, flickering like a candle in a storm. The figure recoiled, its expression twisted with fury, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in its eyes now. The garden, for the first time, seemed to falter. "Leave me," she screamed, pushing back, feeling the light grow stronger with each breath, each thought of resistance. The figure stepped back, its hand retracting, as if the light had burned it. The shadows surrounding her began to retreat, losing their hold. With one final surge, the light consumed everything. The figure shrieked, its voice high-pitched and furious, but it was too late. The light grew, swallowing the shadows whole. And then, as the last vestiges of darkness faded, there was only silence. She was alone again. But this time, she was free. The garden had lost, the silence stretched out before her, stretching deeper than the vastness she had just escaped. She stood in the stillness, her breath steadying, her heart no longer pounding in frantic desperation. The light around her was warm now, soft, a quiet comfort against the deep chill that had once gripped her. It felt different. No longer a blinding, oppressive force, but a gentle presence that wrapped around her like a blanket, soothing the scars left by the garden's torment. The shadows were gone. The whispers, that maddening chorus, had faded into nothing. It was as though they had never been, their voices lost to the vast, endless quiet. And she could feel it now. The weight of the garden was lifted. Not just the physical absence of the darkness, but the weight on her soul, the suffocating pressure of being claimed, being owned by it. That oppressive, twisting force that had tried to swallow her whole. It was no more. She closed her eyes, letting the light wash over her, feeling the remnants of the cold and fear slip away, piece by piece. There was no more chase. No more fight. No more whispers. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, she was at peace. She took a step forward, and the ground beneath her felt firm, solid. The emptiness she had feared was not empty at all, but full of possibility. A gentle breeze stirred, warm against her skin. A soft sound, like distant birdsong, echoed faintly in the distance. It was as though the world, once choked by shadows, was breathing again. She took another step, then another, each footfall sure, steady, as though the earth beneath her was finally welcoming her home. She wasn't lost anymore. The garden, the shadows, the figure, everything that had haunted her, that had tried to tear her apart, was gone. She was free, truly free, and this time, the light around her wasn't a trap. It was her path, a path leading her forward, into the unknown, into something brighter, something more. And as she walked, the final remnants of the darkness faded, like a nightmare slipping away with the first rays of dawn. The garden was no more, and she, at last, was free,